Framtidens E-Handel, Sveriges ledande podcast inom retail och e-handel, sponsras den här veckan av Custom. Hej då Klarna Checkout. Hej Custom. Sveriges mest använda kassalösning är nu ännu bättre och byggd för hela din affär. Online, i butik, på event. Med Custom säljer du där kunden är. Samma smidiga upplevelse och marknadens vassaste konvertering, oavsett kanal eller marknad. Självklart kan du fortfarande erbjuda Klarna, men nu har du dessutom tillgång till fler betalsätt än någonsin och smartare leveransval. Allt det här med en enda integration, helt utan tekniskt krångel. Låter det som framtiden? Det är det. Läs mer på custom.co och följ Custom på LinkedIn för senaste nytt.
Hej och varmt välkommen till ett nytt avsnitt av Framtidens E-Handel. Mitt namn är Björn Påmas Spenger och idag ska vi prata med personen som tog DB, som tidigare hette Douchebags, och drev processen för att genomföra en exit och försäljning till LVMH. Varmt välkommen till podden. Welcome to the podcast, Chris Booth! How are you, Chris?
You have to translate that so I know what it means.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you that. No, I just hyped you in the podcast now. And Chris, I'm super thankful and insanely excited to have you here. You flew into Stockholm yesterday from Oslo, right?
Yeah, I'm just here for a few days. Coming to visit you was like a really good excuse to come to Stockholm because I've only ever been here once before and I love it here. I went for a run in the park this morning. It's like more fun version of Oslo. I'll probably get killed for saying that, but
How did he end up in Norway? Because you're Australian, right?
Yeah, I'm Australian and I actually didn't end up straight into Norway. I was in France for a few years. It's been a bit of a long journey, but I left Australia 10 years ago in 2015. To begin at the end, my wife is Norwegian. We have a 5-year-old daughter and she's sort of a much more impressive person than I am. So I sort of said, okay, I'll come to you and
I'll do whatever.
What do you need? Yeah, what do I need to do to make this work? So that's what made me end up in Oslo. But I actually left Australia in 2015 to move to France to work for my first brand.
How old were you back then?
I would have been 25, 26 years old. Before that, I was a lawyer in the Supreme and Federal Court of Australia, standing up on my feet, talking to a judge. And before that, I was a professional skier.
That's not that common, I guess.
Yeah, there's not many of them, but my parents were retailers who sold skis, snowboards, surfboards, water skis, and windsurfing equipment. So they love, all of these action sports. So I grew up in that. And then I kind of got good at skiing just as like the free skiing sort of revolution happened. And I got swept up into that, got sponsored really early by a few brands. And that gave me like a ticket to the world at like 13 years old. I was the youngest person actually to compete in the X Games. Not the best, but I was the youngest at, 14 years old and did that for a few years. So that got me out of the suburbs of Sydney and across Europe and the US, which sort of changed my life. And I did that through my teenage years. But, being a skier from Australia is about as good of a long-term plan as being like a surfer from Sweden. Like it's just not, it's hard to make that work. So I always knew I had to go to school. So I worked really hard, did an MBA, did a law degree, and then ended up working in 2 large law firms in my early 20s out of university. Started by working on class actions and covered the subprime mortgage crisis of 2009. So a bunch of people who lost their money because of dodgy bank loans. Worked on that for 2 years. Then I went and worked in a smaller litigation firm where I was literally in the court every day, up on my feet, had my own clients, which I loved and I also hated. And I used to live for the weekends, right? Like I would basically spend my weeks sort of in some sort of dead zone. And then I would come alive on Saturday and Sunday. And after 3-4 years of doing that, I was just just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. Because if you don't have that energy resource for it, you'll never really do your best work. So I was able to just go to work, but it was meaningless. I wasn't as driven for it. And I just kind of I had a quarter life crisis, a very early life crisis of what have I done? I've invested all this time into this and I've achieved it on paper. And yet I couldn't give a shit about this. I don't care about any of this. So that's when I decided to pivot.
How hard was that decision?
2 friends of mine called me one day and said, Chris, we want to plan a 1-month snow camping trip in Alaska. We want you to come. And in the legal services industry, like top tier law firms, suit and tie, very strict culture, like no one takes a month off. Not even partners take a month off. And I remember going to work one day, like trying to think, how do I say yes to this? And then I was thinking, well, who would I be if I said no to this? What path would I be on if I started passing up opportunities like this? And I realized at that point that the decision was very easy. So the same day I went in and said, I'm going to take this month to do this. And they said, well, you can't take a month off. And I said, no problem. I'll just quit then.
Wow. That's quite bold though.
So I dropped it. And then they said, well, we can talk about it and there's maybe a way. And I said, you know what? Now that I've just told you I quit, thank you for your offer, but I think I quit anyways. So just like that, it happened. But the catalyst was two friends who promised a big adventure. And that was like the exit door that I was able to open to give myself permission to change. Went on this trip. It was crazy. It was a lot of fun. It was scary. And it was just a very transformative moment just to pause and reflect at like 25 years old to ask myself, how do you want every day to feel? And I realized that like if you just have intention in what you're doing, then you're going to do your best work, or at least you're going to feel like you're doing your best work. So just do what you want to do. And if you do what you want to do, then you're going to be motivated. And if you're motivated, then good things will happen. So I just kind of pulled on that thread, and then out of the blue, a guy I knew from my time as a skier, French guy, started a small ski brand that was doing about 2 million in turnover at the time, called me on my birthday, which is a very old-fashioned thing to do. He still does it. He calls people on their birthdays. Like, I don't know if like you or, any of your listeners know, like maybe our grandparents kind of do that.
It's always the same people calling you on your birthday. It's just a few. Family, obviously, plus one or two,
Yeah, it's like this forgotten thing of civility. But he called me because it was my birthday. He said, happy birthday. And we just started talking, and he was telling me about his company. He said, well, look, we've just raised a little bit of money and we're looking for like a head of marketing. And without thinking it through, I said, well, I could do that. And like I had done like a marketing major in my business degree, but I'd never had a marketing job. He said, okay, well, think about it. And anyways, there was a bunch more qualified candidates there also who spoke French. I didn't speak French. I was in Australia. But him and a few people I knew at the company kind of came into bat for me. And they said, yeah, all these other candidates look great, because they were like on paper way more suited. They said, this kid knows this culture, knows this sport, and knows this brand. We should bring him in. So they gave me an unlikely shot. And that got me from Sydney to France, Chamonix. And that was my first sort of brand. I started that in, I want to say December 2014. A new CEO came in 2 months later. The company was in a little bit of trouble at the time. It was running out of money at that time. So he came in and he was a much more experienced leader. So he had come from Lacoste, formerly Carrefour Supermarkets. So like a senior French business leader. And he kind of took me under his wing and he just tortured me for 4 years. And I basically learned as much as I could from this guy and worked as hard as I could. And that company went from 2 million to 20 million in 4 years. Which is actually not 4 years, it's 4 winter seasons, because a ski brand is not a good business. A business where you sell something just 4 months of the year is very challenging. Managing your working capital and your cash flows and all of that is a nightmare. Very, very difficult. When you have to order everything at one time in the year, but then you only sell it at another time, it's kind of a nightmare. And ski brands typically fail. So this brand basically grew 10x over 4 years. I wasn't even familiar with the idea of growth and like the objective of growing something by a multiple of whatever.
How did it grow 10x? What was the driver for that growth?
There's probably many versions of that, as there is with any growth story. Here is mine. Number one, it was not a ski brand. It was a culture brand for people who like to ski. So therefore, it was a very different brand.
What do you mean by that? Like it has a broader target audience?
Brands in that category sell products with features. It's more technical. It has some sort of, they make up names for innovation and then they kind of just like peddle that to the market each year. Black Crows said it's not about that. It's about the culture of skiing. So they told a story of this idea of skiing being a noble pursuit that deserves to have its place in the canon of culture. It's not holidays. It's not X Games, it's not Mountain Dew, it's not adrenaline or action sport. It's culture and it's part of history. And then they brought design into it. So the founder brought in a creative director from a design studio named Yorgo & Co. His name is Yorgo Tulupas. He's very famous in France for this, who did the logo. But then he embedded that creative agency in that company from the get-go. And everything that company did had this sort of very distinct Swiss Helvetica chevron V shape to it. And they built a world, a graphic world and a language out of the brand. So it had a different point of view on the category. It's about culture, not skiing. It had very, very strong design language. And then they brought in people like myself who were actually from the sport. Another guy who started a brand called Armada, which was sort of very innovative at the time, who was one of the sort of founders of the free skiing movement. They brought him in to shape the skis. And so the shapes were just very good. They performed well. But it wasn't about tech. It wasn't about innovation. So, good product from the perspective of shape, very good design, and it was about culture. And that spoke to an audience in a way that they hadn't been spoken to before, and it worked. So the brand, let's call all of that, the brand was distinctive and differentiated and came with a unique perspective on a category that has existed for like 100 years. The second thing that made it work was really the CEO who came in, who basically put in place a structure to create enough leverage to get it growing. So being unafraid to sell, to get organized to sell, and to sell in the right way. A lot of brands that get started, they focus so much on their product and their brand that they forget that to have a business, you have to make money. And if you want to grow the business, you have to make more of it. So you do have to sell things. So despite being cool and probably the coolest brand, being unafraid to sell and balance the two, commercial imperatives and let's call it brand equity and desirability, and managing those two on a scale as you grow, that CEO was masterful at that.
And to me, this is a classic direct-to-consumer situation where the heritage is, product and/or brand, but they struggle to put certain structures in place in order to sell. So it's like this combination of, the two direct opposites, brand/product and a structure to sell in an efficient manner, a structure to put an organization in place and have good ads output and everything. And, bringing these two worlds together. But my question would be in Black Rose, because you were there for 4 or 5 years, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So before you started there, exactly what was in place and what was added during your 4 to 5 years at Black Rose to the business case in order to make it 10x?
Concretely speaking, the company was known in France where it had started. And it had a sort of an antiquated couple of salespeople to go out and sell to some shops. And they had this rule of one store, one town, one store per town.
Okay, so it was a wholesale business then?
It was a wholesaler.
All right.
Yeah, just wholesale. It didn't even have like an e-commerce website. So first thing we did was we built a team per market to actually go to the market and tell this story to them and eliminate sort of sacred cow rules like one store per town. I said, well, that doesn't make sense. So we grew the wholesale by structuring it as a team and having a clear process from the beginning to the end of that, cycle, which it didn't actually have. It was sort of like call people and see if they want to buy some. And that was the approach. So putting in place a process, putting in place a team, being intentional about how you do that, that was, let's call it 16 of the 20 million, growth. Then we added an e-commerce channel. And we started actually just by offering it to professionals. So instead of going out and finding consumers, we just said it was just basically email list based, where then we enabled them to just buy on our website. So it started off similarly. That got us to about 1 million. And then we started gently advertising. At the time, it wasn't really that big of a thing. But ultimately, that built a $3 million business on top of the $16 million business. It gets us just shy of 20 million. So we added e-commerce, pretty simple. But really the approach was geo, because the US market is it's the big elephant that every European brand wants. And we went there. We went there very fast. And all the European brands said, go slow, be cool, don't kill your equity. And we said, well, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to go really fast. We are going to sell to every good shop. We didn't go to the tier 3 shops and things, but we said we are here to work with every store, and we are going to take real estate space in those stores to compete. So we took an approach based on availability, which is often missed by brands, where they think, oh, I have to be really scarce and then a miracle is going to happen and I'm going to grow. In truth, for most small brands, the issue is not whether you're cool. The issue is whether you're relevant. And if you're not visible, then you can't even be relevant. Let the people decide if you're cool enough or not. Let the people decide if your product is interesting.
What's the difference between being cool and being relevant?
Well, you can be cool, but you can be irrelevant if no one knows who you are.
Okay.
Coolness is perception. It's distinctiveness, differentiation, desirability, these brand elements. But if you don't have brand awareness or salience, awareness is people, they know who you are. Salience is when you become a mental resource for people, so that when they go in market and they move into a buying situation, they think of you, they associate with you. If you don't have those two factors, you're not going to grow. And this is so often confused in startups, especially in like the fashion and lifestyle space, because they're so scared of people not thinking they're cool that they never give themselves the opportunity to become relevant. And what I loved about what we did at Black Crows was that there was a strong culture that said, be scarce, stay low, because if you're a secret, then no one can challenge you whether you're cool or not. And the CEO said, bullshit. This brand is cool. The problem is that this brand is not available. It's not relevant. It will be a lot cooler if it becomes more relevant. So we're going to go fast, we're going to increase availability, and we're not going to apologize for that. And the ski market is like a village. It's a very antiquated market. They were shocked. They said, oh, no one does this. How dare you? But it made the difference because the company was able to go from 0 to 5 million in 4 winters in the US. So it became 25% of the business, and it put the brand on the map there. It got it through the death zone, and it took a position, roughly 1.5-2% of the US market. And by doing that fast, it was able to get to a sustainable size, and it was able to make an impact. Many, many other brands have attempted the US markets, and it hasn't worked out that way. So I would say it's 50% what we did, and the other 50% was luck. But that to me was a real learning, because I was very persuaded, and I was sort of part of the, let's call it the culture of the brand, where ultimately all you want to do is for the brand to be cool and be liked. But what I really learned out of that was, when you have a CEO who really understands how things grow, that you actually can challenge some of these like rules of thumb or like unspoken laws. You can challenge these things. And often it's because you challenge them that you can create results that others can't. So that for me was the first like key learning, was like, how are you going to outcompete the market in an existing category that has low growth? Why should what you're doing create results that are different to what everyone else is doing? So you have to start to challenge things and not just accept them as they are. So Black Crows was a good brand with a strong offering, very clear, that was at a good moment in time. So it had all of those tailwinds going for it. But then being assertive and intentional about growing it, and having the guts to go against some of the traditional ways of doing things, was really, I would say, the reason why it succeeded where others did not.
And Chris, I'm so thankful for you being here today, because this is so interesting. I have to say, I'm enjoying this so much. But by now, you're only 30 years old by now. And first you did a pro skiing career. You did the freaking X Games. Then you did a lawyer career and started 5 years probably before that. And after that, you did freaking Black Crows, which was a super successful brand that blew up in 5 years. I'm trying to understand, what is your core here? I mean, one core is, it sounds like, let's say, a brand heritage or an understanding towards that area within the business. But what is your core within business, would you say?
I always get recruited into some sort of marketing job. So you could call that my core. What am I at my heart? I'm some sort of a marketeer. I just think marketing is the core of like how a business operates, right? It's Kotler's 4 Ps. It's what's your product? How are you going to price it? How are you going to get it out there? And what story are you going to tell? It's the fundamentals of any business. So that is my core. I was a lawyer, but I also did an MBA. So I've 2 degrees. Then I got my Officer of the Supreme Court certificate. I practiced in the courts and all of that, but then switched because I loved studying business and I just couldn't help it. But I think I love brands the most. There is kind of nothing better than to build a brand, but there's nothing worse than to build a company. And I find that tension very interesting. I really enjoyed at Black Rose this idea of going on a journey to build a brand. So you're kind of getting in a little sailboat and you're going to sail across the sea and you're going to get somewhere at the other end. That sense of journey is what gets you up every day of the week, and it's what keeps you going. You have this idea of distance over time, like you're getting somewhere. And then at the end of it, you have something to show for it. Because in what we do, it's very hard to make tangible the work. Like I envy people who build houses because you do the project and at the end of it, there's a house there. You can take a photo of it. But in, management and professional services, you kind of just manage information and people, and it's very hard to say what you did. So at Black Rose, I got basically a marketing role, managing the marketing mix. Then the CEO put me in sort of like a market business development role. And then I ended up overseeing the sales and the marketing at the company. So I was like sort of the number 2. And I led the US market entry and also the establishment of the e-commerce business. So typically I get typecast in as some sort of marketing type, but that's not who I am. I've done several sales-based roles, but that's not who I am. I have changed brands and shaped brands, but that's not who I am either. So I'm sort of avoiding labels because my goal is not to become a specialist. My goal is to build brands. And I actually think that the next step is going to be the defining one, because in my observation, a lot of these roles, a lot of these labels will cease to be relevant not long from now. The way in which you build a company is going to change. All of this is going to change. So from a future perspective, I don't really see the value in becoming anything too specific, because I think not long from now, you won't need that.
And that's the cliffhanger for the conversation later in the podcast episode. It also sounds like during the Black Rose time, you met this Norwegian girl that ended up being your wife, and then you moved to Norway, right? Because after Black Rose, you did DB, that back then was called Douchebags. How did you end up becoming involved in DB?
I moved to Norway and I was still working for Black Rose, but in the role I was doing, which was quite demanding, my center of gravity was shifting away from the HQ. And over time, it just became quite obvious that I probably needed to find something more local. And in case there was any doubt, my wife declared it to me when she was 8 months pregnant and said, "Chris, you're not in the pension system here. You work crazy hours. I need you to be reliable." And so I said, all right, I'll find something down the street. At around about the same time, the founder of the company sort of reached out to me. We had a couple of conversations and they were looking for like a head of marketing, CMO type. And I said, okay, but here are my 2 conditions. Number 1, change the name. Number 2, reboot the product lines. If you can agree to that, I will go in. And they were open-minded to such a way that they said, okay, let's do it and see what happens. So that is how I got a job down the street from where I live at a company then called Douchebags, which was at about 120 million NOK in turnover. So a successful startup that was about 8 years old that was looking to figure out how to take that next step and become like a small to medium enterprise.
Okay, what exactly did Douchebags look like when it made 120 million NOK in terms of, the people count and what they sold and what they did and how they operated? Exactly where was Douchebags back at that moment?
Douchebags is a brand that is in the travel market, referencing subcultures in action sports. selling basically bags, luggage, and accessories. It was roughly, I want to say, 18 people at that time, which was covering sort of the essential basics of the company. And it was about an 80-20 e-commerce to wholesale sort of split. And it was an ascendant brand. What was really unique about the brand is that Truls started it with a very well-known Swedish athlete, maybe even celebrity here, named Jon Olsson, who really wrote the story of that brand and really was the face of that brand. You could even say that Douchebags was the Jon Olsson brand. And I would say 80% of its customer base were his followers. So, Truls and Jon, by, working together, were able to make products and promote it through his channels very successfully to get up and out of the gates and tell a story and get people behind it. So that's where it was in about, I would say, 2019, early 2020, when I jumped on board. It was a brand that started in a very, I would say, authentic action sports space, but had become increasingly driven by influencer marketing, which worked until it didn't. So that was also where I found it. The brand had, I would say, drifted a little bit aesthetically in terms of DNA from where it started, I would say, because of how influencer marketing shaped its aesthetic and its audience. So it was also at a point where, despite being ascendant, its rate of growth, because it had had spectacular growth for several years, if you follow the trend, it was slowing down. So if you were to make a bet on it, by changing nothing, that growth rate evolution would continue to, sort of slow down, and then eventually it would go flat and go in decline. So it was just at a natural moment where it needed to get ready for a new phase, a different game than the one it had played. So it was sort of at the crossroads, if you will.
Okay, so you have probably an insane brand recognition globally through Jon's following, because he's been wearing the bags and, showing the bags and gifting the bags to all his friends. So Douchebags as a brand was a really, really big brand. But on the inside, I can imagine it was a little bit messy when it comes to, let's say, supply chain and marketing and operations and team and so on. What did you see was the potential with that project?
When I took the project on, to be honest, I was feeling very wary, because Jon Olsson was really driving that brand. He was bringing the customers in. He was shaping product. He was telling the stories. And he is such a phenomenal talent, to be honest. Like, how many people do you know who can build something like that just by telling their own story? So, you have probably one of the most impressive talents of our generation leading the brand to that point. What do you do with that? I actually found it was a really interesting challenge to figure out, what would a next step look like, respecting the DNA of the brand, but acknowledging that if you want to, what got you there won't necessarily get you to the next step. But more deeply down in that brand, there were assets that I thought were very valuable. Truls had been adamant from the beginning that, he wanted to bring a sort of clean Scandinavian design aesthetic to the category, which was sort of a junk category. That's an oppositional point of view. And brands that, not every founder is a genius and not every brand deserves to survive, right? It's not a given that you could just grow anything. There has to be certain factors of success in place in order to have a case. Douchebag at the time, in my perspective, really had a lot of fantastic assets inside of it that gave you the confidence or the conviction to say this brand, this way could grow. So number one was the insistence that product should be excellent, and you can bring a sort of a more cleaner and more sober aesthetic to a category that was sort of overly stylized and a bit of a junk category. So you could clean it up and you could create product that people would feel comfortable in their sort of, let's call it adventure or weekend mode, but also feel very comfortable with, in a city where you have, two kind of very different aesthetic requirements. Their goal was to make products that could make you feel comfortable anywhere. And that is how you be a good traveler. Think about bad travelers. British, Australians, where they go to places and they stand out, they make noise, they don't fit in. A good traveler is almost invisible. They look and feel like locals wherever they go. So this idea of, building this sort of transversal crossover Scandinavian driven design meant that these products could make you feel like a local wherever you are. That is powerful. We can do something with that. That's the first thing. Second thing was that Jon Olsen also set the bar really, really high in terms of communication. His storytelling, his sort of Cinderella arc of, telling a story and then having that eventuate in a live shopping moment was really powerful and, set the bar for a marketing team much higher than most brands of that size. And there was talent already in the company who kind of were used to that. So I said, okay, well, you can act in a way that's outside of the norms of brands at this brand and get away with it. And the customers will love you for it. And last but not least, and this took a while to unpack, but Douchebags was a name that was very interesting for a startup because it's provocative. It's divisive and it's sticky and it's memorable. It has a lot of good features about it. The issue was that English speakers saw it meaning something else because that word has evolved over time. The name sort of came into popular culture in the 80s. I think it was actually in the film E.T. that it was first introduced. And it used to mean idiot, like a stupid person. And in Norwegian, it kind of still has that connotation. But in the English world, it came to mean a white, male, rich narcissist. So the meaning of that had changed. So when Americans saw it, they said, well, look, I get it, but I don't find it funny and you couldn't pay me to wear it. So we had this blocker because of the name. How do you walk back from that? How do you walk back from a name like Douchebags? But by looking into the DNA of the brand, they'd been using the little logo called, which is just the D and the B. And we thought, well, okay, well, could you just use that? Could you just become something that isn't a name, but is just a body of value and meaning? And inside there was this idea that the brand occupies a space between your home and wherever you're going. It's not the top of the mountain brand. It's not the North Face. It's not it's not IKEA. It's not home storage. Like, where is this brand, right? It's on people in those moments of transition between where they came from and where they're going to be. So it's a brand that occupies a liminal space between what was and what will be. So there's something actually very profound and poetic inside this brand, this idea of becoming the in-between places brand, which opens up a new world of adventure, of journeying, of positive transformation. There's so much that can be sort of anchored into that platform. And if you have an idea that is powerful, then you can go a long way with that. So those were the three elements: product excellence and aesthetic, very, very high bar in terms of how you can engage customers with communications and marketing, and then a depth in the brand that meant more than just stunts. It had a deeper meaning, a brand big enough that you could write a book about it. Those three things, to me, were the elements that said this could be a $300 million brand.
What was in place is product, brand, and community, basically. And then the next question is obviously, what wasn't in place and why?
Like I said, nothing better than building a brand, nothing worse than building a company. The structure, because, when you build a brand in consumer goods, there's a marginal cost for every unit that you create in addition, and it starts to get very complicated. The brand also wasn't anchored. Everybody had a different, if you asked everybody in the company what was the brand, everyone had a different answer. So everyone was out there building a different brand. So the company wasn't as aligned culturally on, what are we building? What does this stand for? Where are we going? And as the company was getting past the $10 million mark, it starts to get complicated. It starts to get bigger. People have to coordinate. You have a higher need for systems. You have a higher need for analytics. So all the stuff that comes with getting bigger was still to be done. So it needed structure, but structure is just structure. What structure? Depends. What's the direction of the brand? What's the commercial direction? So it needed direction. So it was a very important time to, start with the brand, because if we're not going to be Douchebags and we're DB, well, what is DB? Then what is the direction we're facing? Where are we going? do we dream to be a $20 million brand with 35 people working here? A $100 million brand with 80 people working here? A $300 million brand with 300 people working there? It really depends what experience you want to have and what's your goal. That needed to be defined, because I don't know if, honestly, anyone at the company had really thought beyond the idea of getting to 20 million. Because when you start something, $20 million seems so big. But very quickly, you're staring that in the face and you say, okay, well, what next? Which calls into question these big existential factors, which is not just those who founded the company, but also those who have invested, etc. Because those are very, very different journeys that affects everybody's interests. And so understanding really the potential of the brand and then deciding what potential is the one you want to go after and what is the experience you want to have was very, very important during that time.
And I think that's one of the hardest tasks to align on a cap table level, because you have to, sit down with the people that are shareholders in the company and align on the lives, basically, because this is not a question of, where you want to take the company, but it's rather a question of what is your personality. I mean, these are big topics and super hard to align on a cap table basis.
We'd also come to the end of a decade, the teens, where the idea was that you build unicorns, and if it's not a unicorn, it's a fail. And yet at the beginning of the next decade, the 2020s, we have all these new forces in the world acting upon companies that says we need to consider all stakeholders. And so actually, how do you choose between three different successes is a really tough question. A 20 million turnover company that's profitable, outstanding success. So is 100, so is 300. So kind of understanding what they mean, understanding if everyone's up for it, and then getting a truly deeply aligned sense of direction and giving it a shot was really a process at the company. That's a real thing. There are no wrong answers to them. So what is the most right is actually challenging.
What did the process look like then? Because I imagine, there were several sit-downs with the stakeholders in the company, and you discussed this back and forth. I also know that Jon, which is official through a podcast he made, he sold his shares way too early. So I assume there were some tensions back then that ended up in changes on a stakeholder level in order to align the stakeholders and therefore direction of the project.
Some of it's before my time. I look at it this way. The company gets bigger, and so it naturally feels different. Building a brand in the beginning is fun because you have total control. As it gets bigger, no one person has the same level of control. That's not for everyone. What I could see was a loose discussion around maybe this brand could get to 50 million in turnover. And on the wall in the office, there was one saying the goal is 20. But there hadn't really been deeper discussion than that about the potential of this company. And maybe that's a Scandinavian thing. In America, people just say, I'm going to 1 billion, right? It's not up for debate. But in Scandinavia, I think it's more modest, and the goal is to create a sustainable company first. And I think that's a culture there. So I would say the first step was putting to the board a plan that said this company could get to 80 million within 6 years.
Did the board believe in your pitch, in your 80 million euro pitch?
Sort of. It took 3 years of consistently talking about the future in numbers and, asking, what would need to be put in place in order to achieve that resource-wise. But the truth is, if you can put in place consistent, 30%-ish growth, which is just good, you don't even have to have a crazy explosion, which so much of the internet talks about exploding brands. I don't believe in them. Just by putting in consistent growth over time puts you in that position, within a horizon of less than 10 years. So just actually looking at things over and over again forces you to confront that and start to really not just imagine the future as a maybe thing, but really put yourself into the future and ask, well, what actually concretely would that mean? So it started by taking a risk and putting numbers in front of a board that they can come back to bite you. And they do, inevitably. But it began, I would say, in around 2021, just before Easter, to accept an invitation to talk about the growth path of the company and to basically do the groundwork to say, but with these products, through these channels, in these markets, with this brand, we believe we can achieve this with this level of profitability. Now, that was the first time there had been, I would say, a 5-year P&L put that got to that result. And I think predictions succeed not when necessarily they're right, because inevitably they're always wrong, but when they create the right conversation. So that was the beginning of starting to think bigger, not just as an idea, but concretely, okay, this thing could get there. We then went through, I would say, 3 years of talking about that in one form or over another.
3 years is a long time. And I can imagine during that time period, I mean, what you did was, number one, changing the brand. And number two, fundamentally also changing the business model from a hype business model to, a recurring, stable, ads-driven revenue business model. Yeah. So the changes and the risk within that time period was quite big. How big were the issues or the problems during that 3-year time period?
I'll get to that in a moment, but I just want to finish on this one about starting to talk about the future. It started in 2021 and it was a conversation for 3 years. And we weren't good at, our first prediction wasn't good. And it showed that there was a lot of things which we hadn't really thought through. There was a lot of things that didn't really add up or make sense. There was a lot of assumptions that were too high. There was a lot of issues with how we would estimate the profitability of something. But daring to put it out there and be wrong on it, and they gave us our first benchmark against which we could measure what to change.
How much did you get it wrong, the first P&L?
Channel. The company is on that growth path today. I would say it's actually a little bit ahead of it. So in terms of top line, it's very much going there. In terms of the composition of that revenue, the contribution of the different channels, markets, categories, it's different. But the general direction is there. So just, I think, daring to just start to talk very seriously about the future as early as you can has a profound effect on employees and all stakeholders, board members, investors, founders. If you don't talk about the future, in my view, it will never happen. And you have to use numbers. You have to use the language of finance to talk concretely about what are you going to do to achieve your goal. I would say that the next part, though, is as important. You then need to build confidence in that direction. To go from it being a cool idea to a true plan, you need to build conviction around your stakeholders. And that comes by hitting your targets, making budgets non-negotiable contracts, and showing progress, but then also introducing new elements that give you reason to believe that, you won't just sort of top out. So over that 3-year period, I would say we made more than 10 business plans. Same business plan, but again, keep pushing, keep refining, figure out your model, keep talking about it until, I would say, when was it? Last year, before we were considering an investment, using the track record of the trailing 3 years at, sort of 40+% growth and new products coming in, really showing the light and saying, guys, 3 years ago, we introduced the idea that by this time we could get to 80 million. Now we want to show you a plan that says 5 years from now we can get to 170 million, which is the same process over, all over again. People fall off their chair and they say, what? You must be crazy. It's very risky as an employee to do that. There's actually no incentive to make bets that might not work out. But it has to be done. You have to dare to think bigger, especially if there is a rational basis for it. So just by thinking about the future, talking about it with your stakeholders, and not just saying it or leaving it up to chance, but truly building the case, planning deeply and concretely how you get there is an essential part of growth. I hear so many stories online about, we did this, this, and this, and the rest is history. Bullshit. Maybe a few get so lucky that something just happens to them and they get swept up in success. That's not a business. That's called winning the lottery. For everybody else, you literally have to live 5 years in the future and plan very precisely to get there. And if you don't do that, you won't.
For that process, I can highly recommend the book Traction. that looks 10 years ahead, and then 3 years ahead, and then 1 year ahead, and helps you define the future, which you mentioned is step number 1. And then step number 2 is, making people believe in this, which to me is repetition. So you just say it 1,000 times, and then you say another 1,000 times over and over again, the same thing until people understand in what direction the company is going. And it's quite simple because there is a bunch of companies that have done this in the past. If you look at the fashion sector or, the travel sector or whatever, there is always a lot of companies that have proven that this is possible, right? So you're not shooting for the stars. You're not shooting a rocket to Mars or human beings to Mars even. You're maybe not even shooting a rocket to the moon. There is proof out there that this can be done, which also gives a certain trustworthiness towards your idea. So that combined with repetition, I think is super important.
It's dangerous though, because the difference between a visionary and a con man is whether the plan actually works out or not. Don't you think?
That's true. And therefore you have to break down the vision into a super crisp, clear plan, right? And just need to know what exactly are you doing in order to achieve your 1-year goal, your 3-year goal, your 10-year goal, and also understand that you have to do different things during different time periods in order to achieve those goals, right? So you're basically prioritizing the projects you do. But I can imagine in DB, you have the brand pivot, you have the business model pivot, you have so many changes. In the meantime, you probably had, cash flow issues and other big issues. How was it emotionally going through all these shitstorms you did during those 3 years?
I used to think that it was a shitstorm in both brands. And then now I realize that that's just management. If companies were perfect, you wouldn't need people. They would just work. The truth is, no company is perfect. That's why you have management whose goal is basically to make plans and solve problems in efficient ways. And I used to get really burdened by that, being like, oh, this doesn't work today or that doesn't work today. Because I've never experienced a single minute in my career where I felt that things were just working. It's just one fucking thing after another. That's all it is. And only at the end of the journey do you realize, wow, actually that worked out pretty good. So I've matured in that view and realized that, growth is basically, it's like sailing a boat fast, right? Like the mast is always about to break. Your goal is to push the structure that you have as much as you can before you need to upgrade. And you constantly need to manage things which don't work. That is how growth feels. I've never experienced anything different. We've been talking about planning, right? As if as long as you have a really clear plan, it's going to work. True. That is how you move people towards a goal. But there is something to be said, especially in consumer-facing brands and brands that live in culture, is to respect that you've got to kind of give, the Michael Porter school a seat at the table, the competitive-based planning thing, but you also have to give Mintzberg, a seat at the table about emergent strategy. You have to be okay with the fact that some things work out and some things don't, and you have to be able to kind of keep your eyes open and really look. It's like, is this really? Is what we're saying really what's happening? So you have to be very honest with yourself and with others to actually navigate your way through your plan. Like a plane that takes off from Melbourne and lands in London, right? It has a course. X amount of miles takes Y amount of fuel. But the pilots in that cockpit are constantly making adjustments for 16 hours to make sure that the plane lands at the time it said, at the destination it said. And I think it's the same in building a company. You're constantly adjusting in the cockpit. You have to let things emerge, and then you have to double down on those things. And the things that do not work out, you have to be okay with letting them go. I want to give you an example from DB. So DB had this idea that everything had to be digital first, which isn't wrong. But if you take such a stance like that and you turn policy into law, into culture, then it's very difficult to challenge it. What we did, we said, well, actually, wholesale is going to grow. And wholesale at a digital first company created most of the growth between 2020 and 2024. And digital went slower. That is despite the fact that the company's capabilities were more set up to be a D2C first company. It's just that there was a better opportunity in wholesale at that time to use that channel. it took a lot to challenge that. You know, it takes the most senior people at the company to say, guys, here is an alternative viewpoint. I think we should go this way in order to actually mobilize the company to do that. Being kind of okay with the fact that certain channels or markets or products will work better or worse is very important, because when you build a brand, you're very passionate about it. Even as an employee, you get a sense of ownership of it, and that can also make you quite stuck. So, you know, while having, you know, very clear plans is a way to mobilize people and make them real, you also have to be ready to change them constantly. And that is hard, especially in groups.
A good example for this also is Nelly. Because for Nelly, which is this multi-brand store in Sweden that has been around for 20 years selling women's clothing, in order for the company to pivot into new ideas and, you know, challenging the truths they had internally, they had to not only change the management and not only change the board, but essentially do adjustments on a cap table shareholder level to implement or basically get the power or the guts to implement new ideas into the company. These truths that you're talking about, they can be so deep within company cultures. And it's so hard to change them.
There's a tension there because culture, on the one hand, is a tremendous source of motivation and alignment for a company. It's a tool that simplifies decision making, but it can also make it very different to change. I hear a lot about companies being families, which I think is a dangerous idea because they are not families. Like, you cannot fire your sister. But as an employee, you can fire people and you can get fired because you're accountable to your stakeholders. I think the term brand is much better. Brand explains the affection that people share and the values that they have in common and the sense of unity that they feel in the pursuit of a common goal. Brands can feel like families. But the truth is, to grow a company is an act of capitalism. And capitalism is medieval. It's a blood sport. And while you can create a company with, you know, strong supportive values, especially in the Scandinavian tradition, which I really believe in because it makes you want to get up and go to work in the day. Nevertheless, along that journey, you know, if the company needs capital to take a next step, that could disrupt some people who are currently in the capital table. Maybe they don't have it. Maybe they can't participate. Maybe it's not in their direct interest, even if it might be in the overall company interest. To me, that is a natural part of the journey and something to navigate. And I'm not convinced that it ever gets easier. I think it's hard from the beginning and it's only hard thereafter.
Då tar vi en kort paus från poddavsnittet. Med mig i studion har jag Jesper från Custom. Unified Commerce, vad innebär det egentligen, Jesper?
Unified Commerce är väl vad vissa skulle kalla för framtiden i handeln. Jag säger att det är en grundförutsättning för handeln där man som handlare kan ta betalt i alla kanaler på ett strömlinjeformat sätt. Det vill säga att du har en integration, en orderhantering, en utbetalning, en utbetalningsfil att förhålla dig till. Och så har du översikt över hur kunderna beter sig.
Vad är det stora värdet för handlarna att ha allting i samma system?
Ja, men det är ju då rent tekniskt enklare och billigare att hålla en integration istället för flera. Och sen operationellt att kunna jobba med en portal för orderhantering, bokföring etc. etc. Och sen på toppen av det att du får en bättre bild över hur kunderna faktiskt beter sig i de olika kanalerna helt enkelt.
Och ni har ju precis lanserat Custom Mobile Point of Sale. Hur hänger det ihop med den här visionen?
Ja, men precis, så att våran Custom MPOS-app då, som vi kallar den, är vårt första bevis på att vi faktiskt löser Unified Commerce. Och sen kommer vi bygga vidare på det. Men i det här fallet så är det en app som handlaren laddar ner. Man connectar sitt custom-konto och sen så kan man använda mobilen som en point of sale och terminal och börja ta betalt på de ställena man är på. Och sen på baksidan så är det en orderhantering, en utbetalningsfil och allting är liksom i ett paket.
Coolt, och om man vill läsa mer om det här, hur gör man det?
Då går man till custom.co och så kan man signa upp för våran väntelista för MPOS.
Suveränt, stort tack Jesper. Gå in på kustom.co, alltså custom.co, så kan ni läsa mer där. Nu fortsätter poddavsnittet. And I think the big takeaway is really that, as a shareholder in a company, you need to be clear on your own personal vision or direction with your life. Like, what is my reason for owning shares in this company? Communicating this clearly towards others. I mean, that people have different opinions is okay, obviously. But to me, it's very often a quite big bottleneck, to be honest, that, people are just unclear why they are around the table. What I'm thinking mainly is how hard it is to put your finger on your own purpose, on what you want, on what direction you are going in your life. And I think it's not only on a personal level, but it's also on a stakeholder level, just being clear on what you want to do with your life. If you ask 1,000 people in Sweden or Norway or whatever about their direction and their purpose, you probably get a super vague answer from 990 of those. The first step is really about defining your direction, defining your purpose personally, and putting your finger on it. That's a tough exercise. It's hard knowing why you're born to this world and what you're supposed to do with your life.
Do you think that's fair? I think it's fair as a company, because, a company is there to somehow add value to stakeholders. So you can expect a company to know where they're going. As a person, I don't know. I look at my own life and I think I'm much better professionally than I am personally. I have two modes. It's interesting to consider, though. I think as a founder, you really need to know. As a founder, you have an extra burden on you personally because you need to understand, are you in this for life? Do you want to do this when you're 70? Do you want to pass this on to your children? Do you want to be like an Italian or a Japanese multi-generational company? Or do you want to kind of get out in 5 years, get something to show for it, and then go and do something else? And quite often, founders don't really know that. And that can make things difficult in a company for sure. If you look at a company, especially in today's environment, especially when you have all these stakeholders who need to align and getting through that difficulty, as I have looked at now a few companies and worked in a few of them, there's actually, I think, a few really simple steps in a process because you can do so many things and there's so many ways through that maze. So what do? I think there's roughly, I want to say, 4 steps. It begins with the identity and the purpose of the brand. So why are we doing this? What's the point? Who are we? What are we here for? Understanding that deeply makes the thousands of other conversations and decisions much, much easier. So that's step 1. Step 2, get a critical view. This means you need to look at numbers. So financial literacy in companies is too low. And I have been guilty of that for a long time in my career, and I've only really studied it much more in the last few years. But understanding what the numbers say, because if you want to look for the madness in a company, it's in the numbers. And understanding how P&L, cash flow, balance sheet work, reporting, that's where the truth is. So you have to get a critical view of the company and be ready to have honest conversations about that. Once you've anchored, well, what's the brand? What's the purposes of why you're coming together? Step 3 then is find a critical path. I think the abundance of opportunities and alternatives can be like a tyranny on a management team or a founder. Figure out what's the clear line that you can see. If you do this, this, and this, you'll get there. And then in the last step, you need to do everything you can to build a critical mass around that critical path such that it's enough to make a difference. And that is how you filter out everything else. I think about the stuff I've done in the last 10 years. I've done so many things that did not matter. I think everyone can own up to that. So if you take that point of view looking forward, you realize, well, if you just follow those 4 steps and you really try to, create enough mass around a set of initiatives, then you can hope to make a difference.
Yeah, and I'm thinking in step number 2, in terms of cash flow, P&L and everything, in order to do that step well, you got to understand the cause of action mechanisms within, the world you're in. And in the D2C world or the brand world or selling products to end consumers world, there is quite clear cause of actions. And I guess you just got to learn them somehow to understand what is driven through an expansion of your product assortment, or what is driven through an increase in ad spend, or what drives an increased ads output. So you have all these 1,000 different options in order to, achieve your goal. But you got to understand, what is the cause of action of this specific thing right now? And also through that, simply prioritize.
That's, I think, the fault of technology today. Like, one of the biggest issues I see in companies is that they don't know where they are. Where are you? And it takes forever to try and get some numbers together. They're often wrong. The structuring and labeling of data, it doesn't make sense. So it's just really hard to get a clear picture. And I also see, especially in startups or smaller companies, they have subscribed to so many different tools that say different things, but none of it connects. So it's really hard just to get a view of the business, because you have to go to 12 different apps to see what they say. It's really tough because, a lot of cloud-based apps have become available and you plug them in and now you get this. But to get a consolidated view of what's actually going on is actually harder than ever. So it really is something that, I think most people who are starting a business or growing a business probably don't prioritize, is understanding where you are and managing data and getting that into a format where you can at least have a good discussion. All that data, you don't need to be data driven unless you're a platform, but being data informed helps you have the right conversations and lower the volume on all the conversations that don't matter.
And I think the hard thing here is really to say no to things. And I consider myself to be an expert in saying no. And it's freaking hard. There's so many platforms, as you say, in Shopify. You can install 1 million apps and they give you 1 million answers. But, what is the shit you want to focus on? And what is the stuff, you should not focus on? It all depends on what your status quo is, where are you right now, and what do you want to achieve in the next 12 months. You got to say no to 90% of the things, maybe 98% of the things, and only do the top 2% in order to get there. Then in 12 months, you might change what you're doing, right? To take you to the next steps.
That's strategy. And I think that's another word that gets used a lot, but doesn't really exist that much, because strategy requires you to basically connect different assumptions together and measure what would happen if you did that. And then you basically evaluate options. But scenario planning requires, a high level of control over the numbers in your business, so that then you can play with them to say, well, if we did this, this, and this, what would happen, versus if we did this, this, and that. But if you can do that early in your business, you can start to change how you talk with your peers in the management, or with your investors or your co-owners, and remove opinions or vibes or even personality types. You can level the playing field. If everyone sits in front of the same set of facts and considers options together, then you can actually really do strategy. That is, I would say, out of reach for most companies.
So what exactly does this mean for decision making?
We spoke about bringing numbers to the table and trying to improve financial literacy. That is really critical to lifting the thinking and making better decisions. But it goes beyond that, because companies are not run by spreadsheets or machines. They're run by people. So I would say the following. First thing is that it's a lot easier to fall in love than it is to make a decision. That's where the brand comes in. When you've aligned what your brand is and why you're here, it helps filter conversations so that decisions are easier. And people generally find it easier to make decisions that they feel good about. And if the brand is there as a support, that simplifies things. So if your brand isn't clear, everything is complicated. If your brand is clear, everything gets easier and you make more decisions faster, and they're usually better. In any case, if you feel the decision is good, it can only be good because you decided it. So you go and make it so. Second thing is, in classic management sort of theory, there's all these rules that have been established. And if you kind of, hire a bunch of managers or even try and get good at that yourself, it sort of puts you on a path to putting things in boxes. And you sort of use a sort of a deductive reasoning. So you end up in these like very tight spaces of trying to like assess options. So you can end up down a rabbit hole of things and forget that there are other paths available. So simply introducing the idea of considering things on the other hand can allow us to consider options that might not have made it into the room otherwise, and then weigh them up against each other. So even just remembering to, when you talk about one thing one way, and then ask yourself, on the other hand, what could it be if it was in the alternative? And thirdly is that managers are actually people too. People kind of just do whatever they want to do. It helps to make things fun and give people a seat at the table so that they can buy in, because they'll generally pursue ideas that they believe are theirs and that they want to do 10 times better than things that come from elsewhere that they don't feel an ownership over or that they just don't want to do. Those factors are as important when trying to actually not just make a decision, but move people behind it.
I love the fact that we just spent 30 minutes about totally different topics than DB, which I love, by the way. So really appreciate your insights here. It's super interesting. Let's go back to DB's investment. LVMH invested as the first Nordic company, I think, into DB by the end of last year. Where was DB in 2024? In terms of revenue and profits, and why did LVMH invest? What did the process look like before the investment from LVMH?
Well, the process began well before that with a conversation between, the founders and the owners. The recognition that getting to sort of 30, 40 million is one thing, then getting from 30 to 40 to 100 is a whole other thing, and that there would be a need for some support to take that journey. Then it went into a long process of planning in order to figure out, is there a case here that we'd feel confident in telling investors about, that we all believe in? And then it was basically going to the markets. So yes, it is a first for Norwegian industry for LVMH to invest in a Norwegian brand. And I think that's something that, is a real mark of quality of DB as a brand and as an operation, but also a fantastic opportunity for the Nordic markets to prove, certain brands from Sweden have had investment from very high profile, European houses. DB is managed now in Norway to prove that young people coming up and building brands, you can build something here and capture the attention of the majors. So the process was quite straightforward, to be honest. We built a case, a clear use of proceeds to do this project, which would get the brand from here to there. The brand was doing, in 2023, it was at around the 360 million NOK mark, around $36 million / euros.
In 24?
Just under $50 million. And the goal was to say, well, with this investment, we believe that we could accelerate our case and go on a path towards the sort of $150, $170 million mark 5 years from now. So with this capital, doing these things, we could get there. That would create this much more revenue and this much more EBITDA, which would, obviously improve the valuation of the company. Then basically you have to speak with funds about your brand, your team, and your plan. And if they believe in your brand, they believe in your team, and they buy into your plan, and it's a good time for them, then they might consider making you an offer.
So what are they looking for, and how did they prove DB was the right brand for LVMH? Like, what were the questions they asked to prove that?
Well, they didn't just ask about the brand, like the logo. They looked at most of the company through the lens of a brand. So they were quite clear on, trying to understand the category strategy, how category management works, but, using the language of brand management there. They were looking for, I would say, clarity of purpose, taste, aesthetics, and resonance of the message of what is it for, of its purpose, in connection with the opportunity that creates. What I think they saw in the brand, certainly what we've been building, is that LVMH is a company that has several brands under its umbrella that make travel items. They have Rimowa. LVMH obviously is an age-old suitcase brand, and there are others too. Sorry, Louis Vuitton, makes suitcases, but they have a range of them. And what they saw in DB was a well-organized company with a management team who know what they're doing, a brand which has been carefully sort of refined to give it depth, but also clarity. But most of all was a brand that is making premium products that young people want. And all the work that we'd done in subcultures, which aren't on their, in and of themselves great businesses, to be in the surfing community, to be in, skiing and snowboarding, to be in skateboarding, to be around creatives. If you look at those as business units, they're quite small versus the general business of the company. But what it did was show that a bags and luggage brand could be premium, but cool, and young people around the world are using them in airports, at train stations, going to work, going to school. And that is something that was not in their portfolio. We were able to speak the language that they speak, but they were able to see that we're able to speak this language to a younger audience that represents, future market share, growth, and probably an audience that maybe they're not speaking to with their existing brands in the same way. So they needed to find a brand that they would be okay with having in their house. So that's the very high standard that we worked very hard to meet. But they were also looking for, an opportunity to ensure future relevance of their group by having brands that a younger generation is adopting and being a brand that is able to be part of that world, the LVMH umbrella world, in terms of brand adjacency, brand fit, but also attract young people was, in my view, the ultimate reason why they decided to come on board as a partner with the company. It just so happens that that's exactly what we've been trying to build there. We worked really hard for that. So it was very rewarding for, I think, the management team and all the staff to kind of feel that all the efforts had been validated. For Truls, who started the company, and has been on it for 15 years, going to work every day, working on an idea, which he's just trying to get out. To see that be recognized, I think was a real, I can't imagine what that's like. I've never started a company like that, but he did that. So that is kind of a more of a personal view, not a technical one. How did we attract an investor like that? It wasn't about just metrics or scalability. They were looking for something more. They were looking for something special, and they were also looking for something that made sense with their strategy.
And what was the valuation and the multiple?
I don't know if I can actually disclose that because it's a private transaction. It's not on the public market.
It's not been disclosed. That's why I asked the question. And I actually said it wrong because our legacy also did a transaction around the time. And I think, I don't know if they were just before you or just after you and whoever got first, but it's cool that, two Scandinavian companies now do have LVMH on the cap table. And that is for sure strengthening the Scandinavian market to me and saying something about, the companies we are building and the value we actually can create through doing that. And the interesting part is also that the different transactions LVMH makes can look so different. It can be, they can do the same thing, which can be a clothing company selling towards a certain target group, but, one can be all in on wholesale, the other one can be all in on direct to consumer, and the third one can be some combination of that. So I guess the interesting part is that they think brand first and that they are so freaking long-term in what they do.
And they know what they're doing. They're right on it too. So that's what's interesting. They're big and powerful now, and they've stuck to that methodology and they've proven it. Great news for anyone who's building a brand, because these guys have, really mastered the art of building really strong brands that produce, mountains of free cash flow. And that's how they've built, the group that they have is probably the most remarkable business of our time. That's not a tech company, to be honest. I think it says two things, though, for those in Scandinavia. First is that there is now a growing number of brands who have been sort of recruited into this world. You have Holtzweiler, who Sequoia backed, DB, who LVMH has backed, our legacy LVMH. You also have Axel Arigato, Acne. So not that long ago, there were really no brands that were considered to be, on the global stage coming out of Scandinavia. Scandinavia produces, in my view, some of the best brands in multiple industries, but it's not that known for it yet. So I think it is a really strong signal to those building businesses in Scandinavia that you can do it. It is possible and it is happening. The world is starting to look at Scandinavia as a place where, for many different reasons, you've got really excellent companies coming out of the region and actually really, really powerful brands. The second thing that I think is really interesting is that the funds, whether they're groups or investment funds, are increasingly looking at the mid-market. For example, larger firms, luxury, etc., is starting to see a slowdown in growth. The smartest funds out there are starting to look at smaller size that they probably weren't looking at before. So, that's what LVMH Luxury Ventures is. It's a branch of LVMH where a small team there is studying brands more in the mid-market size between, I want to say, 25 and 50 million in turnover that previously that group would not look at because it was too small. Now they're actually looking at the up-and-comers and picking out what they feel is the best of the pack. And I think that says a lot about the era that we're in, where it doesn't take that long for an emerging brand to quickly challenge the incumbents. And so as these funds start to look at the marketplace, they're starting to look smaller. That's great, because there's sort of this tough thing in consumer goods where if you start a company, you can find angel investors, friends and family, investment. There's incubators. There is actually quite a good support system for getting started, getting out of the gates. Then from I would say 5 million to 50 million, you're sort of in Death Valley. You're not new anymore. You're not exciting. Everyone who's there in the beginning kind of thinks you're old news, but you're too small to be noticed by the finance industry that takes an interest in companies because you need to be bigger to get there. So there's this sort of very barren landscape for brands taking that mid-sized journey to find support for their growth initiatives. Super tough. That is slowly starting to change, but it's still very, very difficult. In my view, it makes investment sense to invest into mid-sized brands because, yes, there's things to sort out. But if you're okay with structuring, then you can actually find brand opportunities where it's possible to put in place a good 30 to 40% growth path per year. And over 5 years, the company is 3 to 4 times the size of when you invested. That's a great placement. So the mid-market of smaller brands, I think, is really interesting. There's few people looking at it. The multiples are better and they're less risky than startups.
And this was a super nice transition towards the things you're doing today. And the first time we spoke, this is really where we aligned, meaning the ecosystem to start a brand is really, really strong. And the ecosystem to sell a brand, or at least bring investors or the finance industry on board when you make, 50 million euros in revenues or maybe 5 million euros in profits, is also quite strong. But everything there in between, is, what did you call it? The Death Valley?
Yeah.
And this is what you do today, right? So you're running this shop called Friendly Beast. Yeah. Tell us what you do with Friendly Beast.
Friendly Beast is basically a company that grows companies. And what I do is I bring a coalition of partners together onto different projects, different brand projects. My goal is not to build a big company, but it's basically a management company that finds the world's best partners and we go in together on brands that we believe there is a case for. So I'm currently working across a portfolio of 4 brands across the lifestyle fashion space to sportswear into the accessories, let's call it storage space, but then also something in furniture. So generally looking for projects that possess a couple of elements in common that I recognize, not necessarily a category. First is commitment to craft. There has to be product excellence there. It's just very tough to build a brand without a real product argument. Second is a unique perspective such that you could write a book about that brand. There's some depth there. There's something that matters. There's substance to it. Third is either a unique take on a category where there are a few competitors occupying that corner, or an entirely new category that hasn't really been defined in that way. So I'm kind of looking for stuff without tons of competitors. Number 4 is founders who are authentic, mad but not drunk. That really matters. So yeah, I kind of look for companies that, have these things in common that I recognize, and then help, bring together sort of a coalition of, depending on the project, who needs to be on it. And then together we, help either the, the investor, the founder, or the CEO kind of move through those phases that I now know reasonably well. I won't admit to knowing everything, but I just see so many common challenges that are solvable. And if you have an interesting brand opportunity, you can do it. You can get from 5 to 30 million. You can get from 10 to 50 million. It is doable. And often it's by just putting in place the right structures, having the right conversations, and giving creativity a lot of liberty and a very prominent place at the table when looking at how to make decisions related to growth. And above all, not losing the spirit of the company that made it great in the first place, because that's usually what happens. They professionalize, but in trying to professionalize, they corporatize and they lose the spark that made the consumers come in the beginning.
And how do you ensure that? How do you ensure the company or the brand doesn't lose that?
It begins with the brand, often defining that brand platform and understanding its depth and ensuring that you bring that into every discussion and into the culture of the company is how you ensure that you remember who you are. You don't lose yourself along the way. Second is you have to take a very humanist approach to management. I make mistakes all the time. I constantly disappoint people. Sometimes my work is good. Sometimes it's a bit mediocre. So why should I expect anything else from others? We're all human. So having a humanist approach, letting people be people, and then finding the best in them and helping them succeed by empowering them, but with guidance, but then giving them the space to make it their own and do a good job of it is super important. Often in projects where a company wants to bring in some help or something, typically you see a lot of change. To me, that's a point of last recourse. It's changing people. Talking about people's jobs, and people put in a lot more effort than you think. So making sure that people are respected and put at the center of the organization is critical to maintaining the culture. You have to create a safe space where people want to come to work every day. If you create something that people want to be part of and you make it important in how you manage the growth of a company, then people will want to come and work there that day. So that's really important in terms of keeping the culture. Third thing is embracing risky things in your mix. You can follow the path to rational management to your death because you'll make all the right decisions and in so doing create a very boring company. You have to let madness in the right dosage. If madness sort of prevails in your company, you fly off the rails and it becomes incoherent and chaotic. But if you're not doing at least a couple of things that make you smile or make you scared, then you are killing the culture of the company. Not everything has to have a rational argument, especially in a brand. Some stuff can just be there because it creates the brand.
And this is so interesting because on the one hand, there is a company in Denmark, Copenhagen. I won't say their name because I don't want to put them out there. It's a group doing similar things, picking up companies, scaling them. It's founded by 3 McKinsey consultants or former McKinsey consultants. It's basically too much to the right. They're too extreme and they're too much of the selling part, but too little of the brand part. On the other hand, there is so many brands out there that are too heavy on the brand part that are not, doing the selling part of the business. And you got to balance these, right? And the other thing you mentioned was, product has to be in place and the brand has to be in place. And I think you can quite easily see, is brand in place? Is product in place? Is there a meaning in place? It's something that the gut feeling can help you do. But something that is harder, I think, is there a clear product market fit in this complex combination of community, brand, product, customers, and ever-changing world and ecosystem, So my next question would be, how do you prove product market fit? Is there a certain KPI that shows you this brand or product has product market fit, that it's proven?
Yeah, I can get to that. But the idea of how do you create a culture of performance in a creative culture, that's the thing. There's no magic formula to it, but typically brands that are very creative or very culture driven only work if they're super precise as well. So you actually have to be able to manage in the language of business and performance into that culture, but in such a way so that it doesn't disrupt that culture. You don't want to make people feel stupid. just because you know something that they don't, or you're introducing an idea or a framework or some analysis. You have to translate and transpose that in so that they can use it as their own. You have to inoculate that into that culture, not change that culture and replace it with a standard management culture. That happens all the time. That takes a lot of work. You have to be very patient, but the end result is that you sort of inject into a company culture the rigor and the precision that it needs to succeed without disrupting what makes it great in the first place. So that's my answer there. In terms of product market fit, I would look more at startups where that's really a question. When you come in and work on a company that's sort of 10 million in turnover plus, there's generally already strong signs of market fit. The questions in those companies is more about the type of leverage you need to scale it up, margin expansion, free cash flow, cash conversion cycle, working capital management. That's all the tricky stuff, which is quite technical. But in a startup, when looking for market fit, depends what channel. So let's take it channel by channel. In D2C, the magic triumvirate is, do we have an AOV big enough so that the cost of acquisition on a nominal basis is affordable? A customer on the internet costs X. If you're only selling $40 t-shirts versus like $200 jeans or $400 suitcases, that's a very different equation in terms of growing a business in .com. So you need an AOV that's high enough to make it profitable to get a customer. You also need to see repeat rates in excess of, 30 to 35% on a 12-month rolling basis so that you're confident that if you invest into that customer, you're going to get them back to buy something else. That then touches not to product market fit, but product mix fit when it comes to scaling. Do you have a product that people will come back to and buy another one either as a refill? So like, for example, a blank t-shirt can be that, or a pair of socks, or if you're a supermarket, milk, you buy that every week. Do you have a product portfolio that's giving people a reason to come back or not? Or are you a one-time thing? And thirdly is your conversion rate. Like ultimately, are you actually getting people to buy things from you, which you need to see, I would say, over the 1.2% mark to be in a safe space. If you see those three elements come together, you can make a case for having product market fit in D2C, in my view, and you can scale that business in that channel. When it comes to wholesale, it's difficult because wholesale, you're sort of one step further away from the end consumer. But what you want to see ultimately is that, number one, are stores buying from me? If I show up and show my products, or I do a trade show, or I get a sales manager or whatever, am I getting new doors? Am I increasing the number of customers who will buy from me? And then secondly, you want to see, are they reordering from me? Are they buying again after their first buy? Do they come back to refill? If you don't see that, it gets very difficult very fast. And wholesalers, retailers, but people who buy through the wholesale channel, they see everybody. They see every product. They're experts. So often they will tell you if your price point is too high, if you're not competitive, or there's no space for you in that category. So I would say that's how you know when you have product market fit. Are retailers saying yes? And do you have the key metrics for success in your .com channel?
Super interesting. And I'm thinking about one thing DB did, which was that, LVMH bought Rimowa. Rimowa was pulled out of all wholesale due to that transaction because they wanted to go D2C only, because they saw the brand is so strong, it doesn't really need wholesale as a sales channel. And then DB saw this as a big ass opportunity, right? So, and correct me if I'm wrong, DB started to place the luggage on a pricing level that was a direct competitor towards Rimowa, but since Rimowa was removed from wholesale, you guys could basically take the same spot within those retailers.
Yeah. Same with, you saw what happened with Nike, right? They said, we're going to go D2C. Strategy doesn't happen in a vacuum. If you do something, there is an effect to that, right? The world will change and respond. So when, a brand decides to leave a channel, it creates shelf space that's up for grabs that you can move into. So that was the way we looked at it. We saw it as a fantastic opportunity for a new premium brand to go into those points of sale as Rimowa was leaving them. And that was a large business. I would say, though, when looking at channels, it's a game of chess. Like you should never, in my view, never have hard rules because it's just going to cost you later. You should be sort of channel flirtatious because at different phases in the company's life cycle, in the brand's life cycle, in the company's life cycle, in market life cycles, in certain product life cycles, different channels can offer you different benefits. So actually what I see is it's really hard to get a brand up and going in the wholesale channel now. There's a few that are doing it, that basically they have a simple business. They don't really do e-commerce and have that yet, but they've made a product. They go and sell it to stores. They get pre-orders. They open doors, and that gives them a revenue such that they can, you know, just get out of that danger zone, get to a couple of million in revenue in a simple way. But most brands I see basically are D2C businesses in the beginning. You know, you get your product mix out, you give some away, you do some press, you got your Shopify site, and that's how you get started. And then you look to wholesale as a way to sort of stabilize cash flows, secure minimum order quantities from your suppliers, but also as a next step to get your brand out there. Because retail stores, they're not necessarily just customers. They buy from you, they pay you money, and you earn a margin on it. But then they also put you in their shops and on their websites. And then their staff tell customers about your stuff. As a marketer, that's called marketing. If you get wholesale right, it's another marketing channel where they pay you, right? So a lot of small companies are sort of anti-D2C. I don't know why. Why would you be anti anything? Channels are neutral. There is no bad channels. There's only bad strategy. So playing channels like a game of chess is pretty important because it's always changing. If you're really incumbent in your market, right? If you've nailed Sweden and you're in all the wholesale stores and your brand has really high awareness and you've got the market, then there's a good chance that that consumer's coming to you. They're not just shopping any product and choosing you. So then you might want to start having fewer stores and want to get that consumer for yourself to capture the retail price instead of the wholesale price for that consumer. Honestly, there's not many brands below 100 million who are in that position. So I can't really see that as a reasonable basis why you wouldn't do wholesale because you already got the market. I think that's rubbish. The question is, how do I get people to become aware of my brand, know what it is, see my offering, and be in the consideration set? And what is the most efficient way to do that that does not harm my brand?
And I think the interesting part is not getting stuck in channels and not having a goal that we should be 20% or we should be 40% or we should be 60% wholesale, but that is ever changing over time. And I totally agree that, you know, from 0 to 10 million euros, you should be D2C only because you can easily scale to 10 million euros, any brand or any category, digitally only. It's a great way of showing improving product market fit. But the game from 10 to 30 or 10 to 50 million euros might be different. So different strategies might be applicable for that journey. And then from 50 million euros to, let's say, 200, you might have to open 30 stores in order to achieve that. Of course, you know, it's different from brand to brand. But the interesting part is not setting that in stone, but just having a clear strategy on how you take the next step within your brand. And 0 to 10, direct to consumer only.
I would agree with that. There's always exceptions, but that was quite the story with DB. You know, it was very strong D2C led to get to like the 10 to 12 mark, being much more intentional with wholesaling and going into new markets with that. Got it from the sort of 10 to 50 mark. And then there is conversations around retailing as a next step. It's not always in a perfect cycle like that. It really depends. For example, I'm working as an operating partner for an LA-based fashion brand right now. They're at, what are they at? 13 million. We'll get that growing to around 17 this year and put it on its track to like 30, 35 over the next few years. They operate a theater, 2 retail stores. We just opened another retail store last week. We'll open up one in New York in 6 weeks. And we want to put together a case to open these like mixed discipline cultural venues with retail attached to them. They operate 2 concessions, Dover Street Market, LA and New York. And that's a 12 million brand. So it's actually finding that because it's such a community brand and because it has such a high frequency go-to-market, like 44 collaboration drops per year, 2 seasonal collections, permanent line, tons of events. That type of brand that is, and the product mix that they have tends to just work better by having their own channels because it's too fast for wholesale. Just things move too quickly in that space. So again, I would even like come up short of sort of applying hard and fast rules. You kind of have to look at the brand that you have, the merchandising strategy that you have, the go-to-market that you do, and then consider what channels make sense for your brand at any given time. Exactly.
And too many entrepreneurs do too many things simultaneously, so they are unfocused on achieving the next step. So if you're at 2 million euros, want to come to 10 million euros, you probably shouldn't run Pinterest ads just because you think that would be your next growth channel, but you should probably just increase your content output in order to scale Meta and get to the 10 million euro mark. But Chris, we could speak about this stuff for hours. I'm so thankful for you coming to Stockholm, taking the time for this. If there is one thing you want to get out from this podcast from the community and the listeners, what would that thing be?
For anyone who's trying to make a business or be successful in one, right now there's so much information and less certainty. So at any given point in time, you have to think, okay, well, with what information I know today, I have to make a decision and do something. That is really, really hard. I think it's actually never been more complicated. What I would leave you and your listeners with is one thing, which would be to take a walk on the wild side. Consider things on the other hand and look at your business rationally and then consider it irrationally, because there's always more options available to you than you think. I've faced some situations over the last 10 years where everything felt impossible, and I can tell you that there are always options.
How many times did you think DB would go bankrupt?
Twice.
Yeah? Is it that bad?
It's not going bankrupt like the company doesn't work. It's very tricky to manage the Rubik's Cube of working capital, free cash flows, growth ambitions, markets, categories, teams, market dynamics, pandemics. There's so many forces acting upon a business at any one time that if a few assumptions don't work out in order, you can quickly end up in a tight spot. And it's not about what gets you into a tight spot, but how do you get out of it? And I really find that those tough moments in the business are the moments that I treasure the most, where you get together with the people working there and you say, right, guys, we're going to figure this out. We're going to work through this and we'll get through it. That bonds teams together and it makes the company stronger, because when you get in a situation like that, you get very clear and you realize how you need to do what it takes. And knowing to do what it takes, I think, is probably like the main factor of success when it comes to like management teams.
And the thing that fucks up a company, or the thing that especially risks a bankruptcy in a direct-to-consumer brand or any brand for that reason, is obviously cash in or cash out. So either way, you're spending too much or you just don't get the revenue that you expected to get.
Timing, like space and time, are the factors that people don't talk about. No one wants to talk about how a successful company also, like, you're not allowed to say, oh, it was hard at times. All companies are like that. Like, I don't think there is one company that hasn't had moments of doubt or times when they needed to make sacrifices or work through challenging problems. All those challenges are normal and natural. What makes a company successful is not whether those challenges are visited upon it, but how it overcomes those challenges and how it can create teams that stick together to overcome them.
And it's the same with us humans, right?
This whole podcast makes me sound good, but I'm no better than anyone else. Like, I've worked with people who are just so good. I didn't do any of this stuff. It's a series of interactions between lots of people working in a given direction over time that creates any given success. And podcasts like this, as much as they're great, together with other kind of media, can, I think, shine a light too much on the power of the individual to create the success. But in truth, like, there's so many hands at work, so many people who give up extra hours or go that extra distance or do something they don't want to do in order for the thing to succeed, that I'm like deeply uncomfortable with assuming that it was me, you know, it's because it's not. You contribute and you hope that your contribution made a difference. But in a brand, it's the collective effort over time that gets it there. And that's why brands are cool and they're very family-like, because there is nothing higher than the brand. Nobody is better than the brand. There's nothing greater than the brand. And you're all there at the service of the brand. And that's the ball that you're all collectively trying to push over the line.
And I think this family vibe in the industry we're in is also why I enjoy it so much to work with exactly this. It's like hanging out with friends all the time.
Don't you think that the further I go along, the less exceptional I feel?
And that's just the thing. It's an effect of aging, I think. You know, the older you become, the more you learn, the more you understand that you don't understand things, and the more humble you become. And you just see things from a bigger perspective, I think.
I just have a question. You work with brands. Why do you do that? I mean, you could do anything. You could just do this podcast, right?
Yeah, I just enjoy it. I would never do anything else.
You know what the best thing for me is about building brands? Like, you're working on an idea. It's very fragile. A lot of people don't know about it. But then at a certain point, you start seeing it in real life. Like, you walk down the street and you see one of your products. And then, you know, as years go by, you start to see more of them. And then, like, later on in life, people say, oh, what did you do? Or something. You say, oh, I used to work for this brand. And they're like, oh, yeah, I know that. And it's like touched them in some way. I'm not religious. I don't even have the right to vote in Norway, so I don't vote anymore.
It's your religion.
Yeah, but like that, but you know, like in a time today where like there's lowering trust in political institutions, there's no real, like no one's really religious anymore. What is there available in life to sort of believe in and be a part of that adds value? And I think the cool thing about building brands is that there are these sort of ideologies that people can follow, and there's a business model for that. You merchandise those ideologies with your products, and that creates jobs, that creates progress. But ultimately, it's just putting something out in the world that has a value that people can participate in or belong to in some way. And that is improving upon life by making it a little bit more meaningful, a little bit more functional, maybe even a little bit more beautiful tomorrow than it is today.
If there was one thing you would have to recommend to the viewers and listeners to the podcast, what would that thing be?
There's a difference between doing what you can do and doing what you want to do. Do what you want, and then you can tap into a part of yourself that has more energy than you realized you had, and you can explore your potentials much further than you would otherwise. Now, I was a lawyer, and I had a suit, and I worked in a glass building, and my grandma was proud, and I had a clear path. And then I worked for these unknown brands that were kind of crazy in their own ways. But that's made all the difference. It's added so much color and movement to my life. It's introduced me to so many more like-minded people than I would have met otherwise. And I would just encourage anyone to like take some risk, take a shot, try and walk on an uncommon path that you believe in. And to speak from experience, that has transformed my life more than anything else.
And do you have any books or podcasts you would want to recommend?
There's a book I recommend you read. It's one that hasn't come out yet. A friend of mine wrote it. I believe it comes out next month, and it's called Not a Playbook. And it's a story about the unconventional way in which they built the WeTransfer brand. Damien wrote it because he'd been told that there's all these ways to build a brand, and just none of them applied to how they built that one. So he said, well, there needs to be a book for this. So he wrote it. It's called Not a Playbook, and it's the unconventional path to building a brand.
Amazing. We'll also link the book in the show notes so everyone can go in and buy it whenever it's available. And almost my last question, Chris, who would you like to recommend for the podcast?
I would actually, I don't know if I have a recommendation, but a podcast that I would listen to from you is to meet someone who runs a 100-year-old brand. Because I wonder what they would say. And how that would be different from probably a lot of the conversations on here, which mainly relate to young things. What does it mean to be the steward of something which is old and multi-generational? I have no idea. It's funny, like we often know the the founders or the investors of people who have done things that are young. But can you think of a name of someone who really successfully operates a company that's been around for more than 100 years?
And I'm thinking of the podcast episode LVMH by the podcast Acquired. It's a 3.5 hour episode where they walk through the history of LVMH. And there you really get a perspective of like the number of pivots such a group goes through and every brand goes through, how valuable a heritage is. A heritage that is potentially 100 years old.
Yeah, there's some great examples from Italy, from Japan as well, some of the French. I've never heard the story of someone who's running a 100-year-old brand, and I think that would be a unique conversation.
Good answer. And Chris, if people want to get in touch with you and contact you, how do they do that?
I have a website, friendlybeast.com. You can also email me at chris@friendlybeast.com. So that's my little company that I'm running, and that's where I'm at.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chris, for coming to the podcast studio. Vi kommer såklart att lägga in Chris kontaktuppgifter i show notesen, så kan ni komma i kontakt direkt med honom om ni vill det. Vill ni komma i kontakt med mig så är det lättast på LinkedIn. Sök på Björn Pålmas Spenger så finns jag där. Glöm inte att ratea podden i dina podcast-appar, det vill säga på Spotify och i Podcaster, så kan ni ge oss 5 stjärnor. Så gå in och rate oss med 5 stjärnor i båda apparna, det uppskattas sjukt mycket. Och glöm inte att följa oss i alla plattformar, framförallt på YouTube så har vi börjat publicera videos, så följ oss på YouTube. Men följ oss också på TikTok, på Instagram och på LinkedIn. Så maxar du sannolikheten att lära dig ännu mer, det vill säga att lyssna även på nästa poddavsnitt. Jag vill också tacka vår fantastiska sponsor Custom. Custom är ju en checkout som är helt otrolig. Det är inte bara att den är superlokalt anpassad, det är inte bara att den är typ den högst konverterande checkouten i världen, utan den har nu också möjliggjort att liksom börja customisa hela checkout-proceduren så att du kan lägga in valfria betalsätt, och flexibiliteten är mycket, mycket högre än under KCO-tiden back in the days. Så missa inte det här, gå in och läs mer. Gå in på custom.co för att läsa mer. Det stavas KUSTOM.co, alltså custom med K.co, så kan du läsa mer om den här episka checkout-lösningen i show notesen. Jag vill också tacka våra fantastiska producenter Fredrik Ankarsköld och Mikaela Dorsk. Stort tack för att du lyssnat. Vi hörs igen nästa fredag klockan 06.00. Hej!
Hej!